Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the series Mud Talks, Robots Crossing Boundaries with Professor Chris Clark. My name is Vanessa Chu, Assistant Director in the Office of Alumni and Parent Relations. We thank you for attending, and we hope you and your family are safe and healthy during this time. This talk is being recorded and will be distributed along with any presentation materials after the event. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we will try to get through as many questions as we can after the presentation. Now, to briefly introduce our speaker, Chris Clark, Professor of Engineering, is a Fulbright Scholar, and for the 2011 to 2012 academic year, he held the William R. Keenan Jr. Visiting Professorship for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. His research areas include multi-robot systems, underwater robot systems, applied control theory, intelligent vehicles, state estimation, and motion planning. And I now turn it over to you, Chris. Take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Vanessa. Thanks for the great introduction. All right, so welcome everyone. I actually can't see anyone on my screen, so hopefully everyone can hear me all right, and I'll assume Vanessa will just chime in if things go wrong with my volume or something like that. But thanks everyone for coming. So I start with this picture because it's one of the great motivators for our work. These are sharks, typically not associated with robots. And this talk is really about how robots have crossed so many boundaries in the last few decades. Historically, in terms of their technology growth, but also in terms of where they're used, how they're used, and what they are enabling in all sorts of different places. So I'll start with a little bit of two types of history. First, a little bit of history where I came from with all this. So this is a picture of my local library, which I used to visit often, about a mile away from my home. And I have a very distinct memory of going to this library, below the age of 10 and looking for books about robots. I found one, and I would say about 80 pages were about the big supercomputers that would take up an entire room that might be able to power or provide the intelligence for a small robot. And then the last 20 pages of that book were about that robot. But that was the only thing I could dig up when I was about 8 to 10 years old, way back when. I had no idea. I tried to learn as much about robots as possible, but there really was nothing that I could find. Little did I know that many, many years later, I'd be doing something like this. So this is me and a bunch of students in the Port of Los Angeles watching our autonomous robot follow a shark around autonomously, tracking it. We could log into this robot. We could find out where it thought the shark was. We could track performance. And what was really exciting about this was that it got boring. And in autonomy, boring can be very, very good because it means everything's working. So for hours, having a robot track a shark autonomously, that for us was a measure of success when we just sort of sat there and we're like, well, what do we do now? I guess we just sort of sit here. We went in for lunch, came back, the robot was still driving around. And to me, this is a huge, huge jump in a few decades. But obviously, robotics has a history that has a lot, or has nothing to do with me. We'll say that. There's a lot going on with robotics in the last few decades. Many people would credit this person, Gray Walter, as one of the first people to develop an autonomous mobile robot. And most of this talk is really going to be focused on mobile robots with autonomy as opposed to manipulator robots. But the mobile robot, the first autonomous mobile robots, there's this collection of what Walter called the tortoise or tortoises, because he made several versions of this robot down here. There's actually a sensor up here. There's some wheels and motors. He had very little at his disposal. And what's really interesting was that he was not an engineer. He was not a computer scientist, which I'm not even sure they had that name back then. He was a neuropsychologist, and he wanted to understand how animals, navigated on their own, how they addressed the world, how they interacted with the world. And he thought, what better way to do that than to try to build something that would mimic their behavior. And so he came up with this collection of tortoises, which would track light and move towards them and things like that. And just way, way ahead of his time in terms of autonomous mobile robots, even though he might not even call himself a roboticist. But as the decades went on from the 50s, people got really excited. There was a whole idea of artificial intelligence, which a lot of people sort of got excited about. And the robotic side, the autonomous mobile robot side, was the physical manifestation of this artificial intelligence. So not only could we think of AI as like, you know, can we make things that think like a human? The autonomous mobile robot brought out the, can we make robots that act and behave and have the capabilities of humans or even do better than humans? So one of the first instances of this that sort of gained a lot of excitement was Shaky back in the Stanford Research Institute. And Shaky's got its name because it literally just sort of shake around as it moved around the room. It was the first robot to put in this idea of sense, plan, act, where it would sort of sense the world, think about it, then act on it, and then repeat that. And sort of gather information, think about that information it just got, and then act on it, which was a big deal back in the late 60s. You know, fast forward a decade later in the same area around Stanford, they had this thing called the Stanford Cart, which could create its own stereo vision depth maps and make little local maps of the world that it could navigate with to make sure it didn't hit anything. Now, the Stanford Cart was a pretty amazing achievement. Stereo vision was just coming in, but it was also, it brought out this idea that maybe autonomous mobile robots weren't actually going to happen. And one of the reasons was because what this Stanford Cart did was it would take an image of the world, a stereo set of images, and it would think about it for a couple minutes. It would create the map, then create a plan through that local, very small map, and then move about a meter. And it would take another couple images, think about it for a couple minutes, and then move another meter. And of course, this is incredibly slow. And people thought, well, the computation of this is just way too slow. This will never happen. And it actually, you know, these types of experiments kicked up this whole idea of behavioral robots or behavior-based robots, which are very reactionary instead of planning-based. And that's a whole other talk that we can get into. But it was pretty, again, sort of these monumental achievements of like, we are actually looking at the world and navigating with respect to the world that we're creating models of in real time, if you can define that real time. And as this technology started to come up, we started to really push robots out to where it was either too expensive, too dangerous, too far to put humans. And so we had things like planetary exploration, and we have things like Mars rovers. That really came out as one of these sort of key applications for autonomous mobile robots. You know, another place where we'd send mobile robots, places that are deep, dark, dangerous, expensive for humans to get to, is below sea level in the ocean. This robot from Mbari is actually the size of probably a small van, just to give you scale on this. And this goes to the depths of the ocean, and it does all sorts of fun things. It can remotely control, and it has an autonomous mode as well. It is tethered to a ship, though. But we have other types of robots that are out there. This legged robot was designed to actually, or the intention was for this robot to actually walk around the space station to be able to fix parts, or at least you know, detect failures and things like that, instead of having to send a human out into space. I had a couple friends work on this fun robot. But the application started to move from this sort of, let's send robots to the explore for us, to, hey, can we actually use them for, you know, applications that are a little bit closer to home, applications that we don't want people to do. Here's one which is security. I actually worked with this company for a while. It's quite interesting, Frontline Robotics, when I was at University of Waterloo, and we were looking at motion planning for robots. Interestingly enough, they were into developing security robots that would, for example, scan a perimeter and detect if there are intruders. And this was actually, there's a lot of companies back then, sort of late 90s, thinking about can we use robots in the security realm? It didn't take off so much, I would say. However, at the same time, the idea of using robots in industry, at that time, there's a lot of manipulators, but they also had these automatic guided vehicles, and there's all sorts of spellings of that, by the way. I actually left that spelling in there because I've found so many different versions of AGVs from the day. But the idea that there'd be autonomous vehicles driving around an industrial setting, moving big parts and things like that. And AGVs are still a thing. They don't call them AGVs anymore, but there are companies still trying to produce versions of that. And they're, from what I've seen, not the biggest sellers. What was really exciting to me was the Roomba. And I hadn't decided when this first came out if this was the best technology, it was really exciting to me because it was one of the first cases, if not the first case, where a robot crossed out of research labs with autonomy, with autonomous behavior, and into someone's home. So this was a huge, huge thing for me, just watching, like, after seeing robots being developed within research labs for many, many years. All of a sudden now we are having products, and when they sold over 1 million, I was like, wow, okay, stuff is really starting to happen. This is around the same time too that we actually started getting textbooks in robotics for teaching with. Things are really, really starting to move forward for the robotics community. A couple of years later, I actually joined this company called Kiva Systems, which was brought out by Amazon Robotics. And this was another big jump. I think many people say, well, it was an industry. This is one of the first real cases of multi-robot systems being deployed on scale. So hundreds of robots doing something in a coordinated fashion. And in this case, if you haven't seen Kiva Systems or Amazon Robots, you've got all these orange robots, and the idea is to change how warehouses run, or warehouse fulfillment. So before these robots, a lot of warehouses would have products on shelves, and an order would come in and someone would have to walk down and find the right shelf and get the product and put it in a box and carry it to some place where they, box it up and ship it out. The idea here was to get all these robots, these orange robots in this case, to actually drive under these shelves and autonomously bring the shelves to a person who would just take the right product off the shelf. So all products were at on known shelves at known locations in the warehouse, and it sort of made efficiency jump by around 50%. So this was bought out by Amazon some years ago, and Amazon has increased their robotics since then. But this is sort of a big deal in the multi-robot community too, because not only are there robots doing non-traditional things, but you're coordinating hundreds of robots in a really smart way. Now, robots in the air have really taken off. When I was just starting my PhD around 2000, a group in my lab had won for the first time the autonomous helicopter competition. And those students did not complete the course, but they were the first people to actually make that helicopter fly autonomously, like on the order of 10 meters. And wow, have things changed since then. And now we've got the quad rotors that you can buy off the shelf, and they're very stable. It was very difficult to figure out how to stabilize those vehicles back then. And now the technology's gone so far. This is actually an image of Andrew, one of my students. He actually had this thing autonomously working on landing on an airship. We call it an aircraft carrier here, where we actually want this. This is an autonomous vehicle that he built as well. We'll be traveling around, have battery recharge mechanisms, and the idea is to have this quadcopter be able to land on it, recharge, and move forward. He has since graduated and is now working at an autonomous vehicle company, which is fantastic. But we've got these vehicles out there in the air. And I think what also really started to come up with the autonomous air vehicles is the idea of ethics, the idea of what is right. I remember having a story with, or having a chat, with one of my colleagues while I was at Stanford. And he said how excited he was to meet the person who dropped a bomb, with the first bomb, with an unmanned aerial vehicle. And I couldn't, he was super excited about it. I didn't know what to think about it. Is that scary? Is that exciting? I don't know. But it was sort of a coming of age, and that was around early 2000s. And the bomb was dropped in Afghanistan. But it brings up this whole new approach to things with robotics. What do we do with them? What are we supposed to do? You can go back to the Kiva Systems. Is that a good thing that we're sort of changing the way warehouses are run? It's obviously going to change jobs. It's obviously going to change people. It's obviously going to change culture. Arguably, one of the most positive changes is made is in education and working specifically with K-12 and undergrads for things like competitions. This is a super fun. We've had RoboCup soccer running with all sorts of different types of events for many, many years now. It's, you know, there's FIRST Robotics that has crept down and done amazing things in the K-12 realm as well. But it's really brought on a whole new generation of roboticists. And so for that reason, it's pretty exciting to see how robots have crept there. One of the most, I guess, talked about thing in the media lately have been the autonomous cars. And I think that this picture is great for a couple reasons. One, it's super fun. This is about a story in Europe where an autonomous vehicle was actually pulled over for driving a little too slow by this police officer. And not only is it's just sort of funny, but it does bring in all these things about that are outside the disciplines of technology. It brings in all these issues that can come up, the legal issues. Who's at fault here if there's an accident? Can you actually, you know, who do you give this ticket to at this point? There's no real driver in there. And it sort of goes to show that one, this technology is coming along, but two, there's a lot of non-technical issues that are going to come up, and we need to really think about when we bring these autonomous mobile robots out to the world. So hopefully that gives you sort of a quick history of autonomous mobile robots from start to present. It's got a little bit of flavor of some of my stuff in there as well. And I mentioned in the abstract that I was going to present sort of 3 projects that really cross the boundaries of robotics. And I love how they cross these boundaries. For me, this is one of the most exciting parts about robotics and autonomous mobile robots, is that they can involve people from so many different backgrounds in terms of interests, identity, everything. This first project is, call it fish tracking, could be shark tracking, which is types of fish, I guess. But it's been going on for around a decade. And it all started with a collaboration between myself, this is me over here, wearing the school hat, and Dr. Chris Lowe from CSU Long Beach. Now, Chris and his students, his graduate students, had been tracking sharks and have been tracking sharks for decades already. And what they typically do is they start out with this boat, and they'll go and they'll catch sharks. And so on this long line is a bunch of hooks, and we're just putting on shrimp here. And we'll go and we'll catch a shark. We'll put a acoustic tag on it. We'll release that shark, and as the shark sort of swims around the ocean, the tag on that shark will make these acoustic signals, ping, ping, ping. Now, what traditionally Chris and his team of researchers will do is they want to sort of say, where does the shark go all day? How much time does it spend foraging, resting on the bottom, diving deep, whatever, trying to understand shark behaviors and fish in general, not just sharks. This allows us to do all sorts of things from maintaining our natural habitats, helping change policy on fishing, things like that. Obviously very important. But what Chris would do is when he tracked these sharks around, the way he'd do it is after catching them and releasing them with the tag, he'd drive around this boat, or he'd get his students to drive around this boat, and they'd listen for those pings with a hydrophone. Now, a hydrophone is like an underwater microphone. And at the bottom of this pole right here is one of those hydrophones. And by using this handle here, you could actually turn this thing around. So it actually is a directional hydrophone. And when you point it at the pinger or the acoustic tag, it sounds the loudest. So it's like ping, 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 ping. If you point it away, you barely hear the sound. So what they do is they sort of point, twirl the thing around and say, oh, it's coming over from that direction. They drive the boat over, they write down and log all the GPS coordinates from their GPS receiver. And they do this for about 2 to 3 days straight. So it was quite taxing. You and one other student would be stuck on this small boat for 2 or 3 days, driving this thing around, trying to figure out what does the shark do all day. The idea here is to replace that with our autonomous robots. So this is an ocean server IVR 2 robot that we add sensors to. We also have an extra computer to give it intelligence. It can dive down, but it can autonomously drive around the ocean, basically. It's got a propeller here to sort of move forward. It's got some fins to actually direct it to wherever you want. In the antenna, there's a GPS receiver or Wi-Fi receiver. What we do is we add these hydrophones. So there's one at the front, one at the back, and these are not directional hydrophones. They're omnidirectional hydrophones. And they're listening for those same shark tags pinging. So here's sort of a top-down view of how we do this. Here's a shark over here with an acoustic signal, and you can see these sort of waves of the acoustic signal traveling forward. Now we've got one of those hydrophones, H1 here at the front, one at the rear. And the idea is by looking at when the acoustic waves from the pinger hit the hydrophones, hopefully we can figure out where's the shark. So there's a couple things we do when we look at when that signal hits one hydrophone versus the other. Because the shark is actually closer to hydrophone 2, the sound waves will hit H2, hydrophone 2, before H1. And based on the time of arrival difference of when it hits this one versus this one, we can actually figure out the bearing alpha to that shark. Also, we can calibrate it if we can have expected times of when it pings, in this case every 2 seconds. We can look at, well, we expected it to send a signal at time, I don't know, 2.83456 seconds. And then we measure when we got it, our time of arrival. We can say, well, it took this long to travel the distance. We know the speed of sound. We can actually get a distance measurement too. One issue here is that a shark here or a shark here will produce the same time of arrival difference between the two hydrophones. So at the beginning, we don't know, is it alpha or negative alpha where it's coming from? But that gets resolved through some good robot navigation as well. For example, let's say there's a shark here, and here's our AUV, and we figure out, you know what, we just got a range and bearing measurement, but the bearing, is it off in this direction or is the bearing off in this direction? We don't know. So the shark's really here, but we don't know which of those two directions it's facing because of that time of arrival ambiguity. But if we do a sharp turn and take another reception of an acoustic signal, in this case, you know, is it in this direction or is it in this direction? We don't know. But if you look at the overlap between the last signal and the current signal, this area is the only area that's got a significant overlap. Now we keep track of this with something called a group of particles or a particle filter. And basically it's a distribution. You can almost think of this as a probabilistic distribution, and that's what it's supposed to represent. And we sort of sample these, and for the particles, as we call them, that are not in the overlap, they get less likelihood of survival over time. And as the AUV or the robot drives around, the autonomous underwater vehicle, is what we call this AUV, we continuously update these particles, and it represents our likelihood distribution of where that shark might be. So we've actually done quite a bit of testing with this in the ocean. This is one of our prime test spots, which is in Wrigley Field Station. And what's exciting is this is actually a biological or a marine biology field station. And for typically graduate students and professors, and of course we bring our Harvey Mudd undergraduates who are typically CS and engineers and sometimes physicists out here to do our studies. In this area, it's great because there's every summer a whole bunch of leopard sharks come in and provide great testing for us. So we start out by saying, how well will this work? And so I'm going to pause this video for a second to explain what's going on. This is a top-down view of that same bay at Catalina Island. Now, the robot is in blue, and this is not with a shark. This is with a tagged boat, just to make sure we knew what was going on. The boat is this green thing, and the boat has a tag that's emitting a signal. And every time it emits a signal, our robot says, okay, the signal is coming from one of these two directions, because we have that sign ambiguity. And we've got the range. It's somewhere on this circle, okay? And you can see in this particular case, the measurement is not the best because this is where the boat is. And this is where we're estimating because our most recent signal is here or here. But, oops, sorry about that. It actually ends up tracking pretty well. And by pretty well, we're usually within around 5 meters. So within the grand scheme of the ocean, we can track things within 5 meters. It's not so bad. In air, you can do a lot better tracking, but in the ocean, tracking can be quite difficult. The ocean's not very helpful. So we did pretty well here in terms of tracking. Our orange circle is the mean of all the red particles. That's a particle distribution, sort of showing where we think the actual boat or tagged boat is. In these areas, it's quite difficult. There's a lot of rocks and a lot of acoustic signals and reflections. Generally, as we get more shallow, it's more difficult to track. In fact, it went under the dock there and the boat went under the dock. But we do quite well. Usually we plus or minus 5 meters. So this all seemed to work quite well. We've collected hours and hours of data. This is just from one particular tagged leopard shark in that same area. The scale here is depth in meters. What's really neat is that the tags on these sharks, you can barely see one here, they actually modulate the signal so you can get a depth measurement because there's a little pressure sensor on there, and based on the pressure, it will modulate the frequency of the signal a bit and allow us to get a depth. So now we use our filter to calculate the XY, the sort of where it is in the plane. And then this helps us get a depth measurement too. So we have a 3-dimensional measurement of where the shark goes at every second. Now, there's many times that we don't get good signals, as I tried to point out a bit. So what we want to do is say, can we use multiple robots to track this shark? And one of the things we wanted to make sure when we did this is that we didn't want to sort of get too close to the shark to actually affect its behavior. So we designed a controller for the robot to stay a distance, we call it RDES, from the shark as best we can. And basically we're just trying to get this robot to circle around, okay? Now it's gonna have its point of view of the shark. But if we have other robots doing the same thing at some different angle on the same circle, we get a different point of view, which is great. If there's kelp in the way, a lot of these sort of points of view will be occluded and things like that, or they'll be multipath, bad reflections off the bottom acoustically speaking. So the idea is to get robots to actually circle around the shark and get lots of measurements without getting too close and actually affecting the shark's behavior. And so we set off to do this with a bunch of control theory, where omega here is the rotational velocity that we might, basically the steering velocity of this robot. And we calculated, mathematically speaking, some good controller to use here. We also said, well, how fast should we go? And we made it with respect to the other robots. So they always sort of stay maybe at opposite sides of the circle or 90 degrees with respect to each other on the circle. What's really fun for me is showing and proving this works mathematically on the whiteboard, then simulating it and showing that we can actually get it to work in simulation, which is pretty fun. So this is supposed to be simulation of 8 robots circling this target. And as the target moves, it actually moves with it in real time. And then going to take that out into the ocean and seeing if it works with real robots in the ocean. So this is actually data from one of our first experiments just to see if we could get cooperative localization. So again, this is in green is a boat that we tagged to make sure that we could actually tag a boat here and get pretty accurate measurements. And you can see the 2 robots are just told to circle basically. And in general, it again worked quite well. It actually worked better. We proved that the errors were less than before. Here you can see that there's a lot of snapping where the particle cloud will jump to the right estimate. And that's when we get a good measurement versus a bad measurement. But we've actually deployed multi-robot formation tracking control to actually go follow robots around, or to go follow sharks around for quite a bit of time. So you probably saw it in there when the boat actually was trying to challenge us go next to a bunch of other boats in a very shallow area. It's very difficult to track. As the boat goes out to go deeper waters, we do much better. We also tried to see if we could improve the tag technology. So Chris Lowe's lab and us, we developed this thing called the smart tag. And the idea of the smart tag is that not only do we have the typical acoustic transmitter, which is this thing here. We also have a camera and a logger to actually log all the video. And we've got an IMU, initial measurement unit, on the other side, just like one that would be found in your phone. And we've got a timer that will actually allow this to unclip from the shark's dorsal fin, float to the surface, and radio to us to tell us where to go pick it up. So at this point, we're just, as we say, tagging the shark. There's a few of us who've caught the shark. We're placing this new smart tag on the shark. This is the very first prototype, which it's a little bulky. We're just making sure the actual shark can swim with this thing. And it doesn't do too bad. I think I think we all agree that it was not very hydrodynamic and a little heavy at the time, so we shrunk them down. But it actually makes quite a bit of difference. And one of the neat things it does is, as you'll notice from this video, there's a lot of back and forth from the shark's point of view. And if you watch it too long, you can actually get sick. So I'll just stop it there. But that back and forth, that's typical of the shark. It's actually interesting. It has been shown through experiments that there is this linear function that relates the frequency of the back and forth of the shark to the forward velocity of the shark. So this allows us to, at every time step, not only do we get those acoustic measurements that come in and say, hey, here's our particles, this is how we should resample. We actually predict the motion of those particles based on the velocity that we get from that frequency. So after we recover this smart tag, we go through all the log data, we go through the IMU data, find out the frequency as a function of time, convert that to velocity as a function of time, and now we have forward velocities of the shark at every time step to sort of improve our state estimation. We also, because of the gyroscope, we actually are able to estimate the orientation of the shark to a much better degree. So we've got forward velocity, we've got orientation, and we take data that used to look like this, which is pretty good, but a little noisy, and turn it into this. And it's much more accurate, specifically in the orientation, which allows us to get better estimates of where the shark was. So we did a lot of work here over the course of many years to get us to this. And it's, at this point, we're going to try to take the system down to Costa Rica. We just got an NSF grant to do that. But we produced many, many publications at this point. And we got to this point, though, and what we're trying to do in Costa Rica is change things a bit, because we have many robots tracking one shark. I think what we're excited about now is going to have a few robots, or maybe one robot, track many fish or many sharks. This is actually a top-down video, thresholded video, of a shark aggregation down in La Jolla. We played with this data set for a while now, trying to look at all the different shark interactions and use this data to say, if we have good models of this types of motion, will that help us and help the robot do the tracking of these sharks? And so that we can not just follow one shark around, but maybe follow or understand how a whole aggregation of sharks moves around the ocean. Do they go out? Do they move together? Do they compress into a tight distribution? And why, for that matter. So some of the sort of interesting modeling things we've done with this is try to come up with these representations that are compact, easy for the robot to sort of carry around, handles all the uncertainty, actually are representative of the actual aggregation motion, and can be updated or adapted in real time if we actually do take in measurements as the robot drives around. And some of the sort of interesting starting points for this modeling came when we started to look at this data. There's actually a group of fish in that same cove in Catalina. So this is not sharks, these are a particular type of fish. And we noticed that the fish would sort of jump around in one part of the bay and then transition to another part and go back and forth on a daily time period. So, these are dates here, and that's 23rd, 24th, 25th. And if you look, every day there's distinct jumps at some part of day. And if you look at this, we had months of data that when during the day would it shift is a function of calendar. So, how far are you along in the season? The idea is to use these types of data to predict the motion of fish and sharks and help us have a robot track an entire aggregation that follows these types of sort of jumps between different areas. The way we thought to do this was to actually take all that data, cluster it into particular geo-reference points, and look at likelihoods of transitions between each one of these points. So think of this as now actually becoming a graph with a likelihood of transitioning between every node in the graph. Something like this. All right, and we actually took that data set and turned it into this graph, and we looked at the likelihood that the actual fish or several fish were jumping between these different locations. We gathered a historical data set to do this. We actually made transition matrices to look at, well, what's the likelihood of a fish being at any one of these nodes and the likelihood of them switching between them, and created these models. And we said, can we get the robots to do the same, tracking? So we actually let the robots follow the exact same models with the exact same likelihoods of randomly staying or transitioning to new places. And we actually, we showed this in simulation. This will actually follow a distribution well. And we sort of had all these different robots and fish particles dropping around and moving between these sort of 6 locations, and all seemed to work well. And then we actually took this out to the ocean, and we sort of set up a ghost scenario where it's like, well, if the fish used the exact same motion patterns as before or had those same motion models and transitions, could the robot actually follow them? And we actually had robots moving around following the same distributions as the fish. I think it was sort of interesting and neat with all of this is that not only can the robots follow them around, it can dive down to different depths and actually collect all sorts of temperature and salinity measurements or images, sonar images, whatever it is, so that we can at the same time track sharks and fish. We can at the same time monitor their habitat. Right? And so this was sort of moderately successful. We had a lot more work to do here, but we feel like we've actually come up with good models that are compact. We only need a few nodes to represent these models, a few nodes in the graph. Because of all the randomness and probability, it handles a lot of the uncertainty that comes with our measurements. If we want to update these models in real time, like for example, the adaptive side of this, if we get measurements on the fly, we can actually update the transition matrices associated with these models. And what's sort of neat is that there's stable dynamics in that if you sort of start from any particular distribution of fish in the graph, it will always stabilize to some steady state conversion or probability distribution depending on time of day. So and that can help with that control theory well. So it's sort of fun. All right, I'm going to shift gears here. It's already 4:41, and I've got a few slides for project 2 here. We're going to cross a different boundary. We've done a lot of work in marine biology, but we've also done a lot in underwater archaeology. Now, the first part of this project, we spent many years traveling to Malta, the small island, 3-island country just south of Italy here. What we're doing in the beginning years is lowering this robot. So this is a robot's about this big. It's got a scanning sonar in 2 different directions here. And the idea is we pilot this thing around at these archaeological sites. This is actually an ancient temple in Malta. It's about 3500 BC. We'd find these access points with flooded chambers and tunnels below, and we'd lower the robot down into them. And we'd drive it around and collect data and create algorithms to actually take that data in and make these maps, these sort of 3-dimensional maps. And the archaeologists love this. We were able to map out all these places that it was difficult or dangerous, or we didn't want to ruin the heritage site to send people down there. So we used robots to do it. I think we ended up on the order of 70 different sites across Malta and Sicily. We made these maps for. So there's actually a database we created with the archaeologists to do this, which is super fun. But we also took this work offshore. And the first stage was, can we help with shipwreck search? So for the last couple of years, we've actually taken another one of these AUVs, torpedo-shaped robots, and we drive around in lawnmower patterns, all right? And we sort of stay at the high surface, sorry, go back if I can, and we collect big sheets of what's called side scan sonar data. So the AUV would travel along here and it would shoot out sonar on both sides, and it would stitch together the response to make these side scan sonar images. With all this data, typically an archaeologist would go and try to look through the shadows and say, hey, is that a cool shipwreck? I don't know. For example, this one might be one. The idea is to use a lot of the recent efforts in deep learning and image processing to automatically identify potential wreck sites or potential archaeological sites. This one here is pretty obvious if you zoom in. It's actually a World War II plane with a tail, wings, engine, cockpit. And this is actually showing, this green square is actually indicating that our deep learned algorithms have identified this as a potential wreck site, which is quite neat. And this is sort of neat stuff. If you read the New York Times, this was all written up a bit in the New York Times about a month ago. One of the most exciting things was a couple summers ago, we actually found a new wreck site that nobody knew of. This was a Fairey Swordfish World War II dive bomber. It's like a biplane that no one had any idea was there, just about a mile off the coast of Malta. When we did our lawnmower patterns, our AUV picked it up in its side scan sonar data set. Our machine learning found it, we identified it, we got a diver down there, and yeah, lo and behold, new wreck, in a historical one at that, which is pretty exciting for us. Once we find these sites, we actually go and have the robots dive down and collect video like this. And we plan optimal paths that get the best images so that we can stitch them together with photogrammetry to create 3D models of these wrecks. So this is actually that bomber plane from the first side scan sonar that I just showed you. And so the idea is whenever it's too deep to get divers down, let's send the robots down to collect the images so that we can make 3D reconstructions of shipwrecks or plane wrecks using any of the data that we can collect from robots. So this has been going on for a while. We've done a bunch of techniques there. It's super, super fun stuff. This is us and students. I think that might be me there. And we're just launching the robots off the coast of Malta here. We've been going there for years, a lot of great work and a lot of great collaborations. So, crossing different boundaries, country boundaries there. We've actually gone all over the world to Sicily, Denmark, Norway, up to the North Pole, Hawaii, all over the place with these robots do this stuff. Marine biology, archaeology, and now I'll talk a bit about into education. And I think this is why I think robots have been a favorite for many education leaders, because robots can be used to cross boundaries in many ways. So a couple of years ago, we decided that maybe we should think about redoing the second year sequence of engineering courses. And we had this one course called E59, which we thought in that sequence we might replace with what we now call E79. And we started with this idea of E79. This is the first required course that everyone at Mudd must take, is that the underlying mathematical models are the key to designing, building, analyzing, and controlling physical systems. And this is sort of what engineers, we thought, did. They designed, built, analyzed, and controlled systems. And so we wanted to get these topics into the course. We wanted to make sure students understood that the mathematical models were the key to doing those 4 steps. And we wanted to be able to show, moreover, that we could apply them to any sort of physical system. So we sort of annotated this figure to show that, regardless of the physical system, in this case, it's an underwater robot, which we thought was a great teaching piece. We do all the same mathematical modeling and show how we could design, analyze, build, and sing these robots. But it's not just robots. This stuff generalizes to all sorts of things. You can use the same type of modeling, for example, on a woodpecker, apparently. And not just things in biology and zoology, but all sorts of systems can be approached this way, which is really trying to bring context of this learning to people. All right. One of the big parts of this course was bringing the robots into what we call practicums, because we thought this would be the great way to bring hands-on learning into what we had traditionally been a theoretical course. You can see us just driving around one of the first robots in this test tank. This course structure had not only classroom stuff, but it had this practicum which is the hands-on learning, 2.5 hours long. And we brought these robots in. They built them with drills, PVC, circuits, and then started programming them a bit towards the end. And the idea was that everything you'd sort of learn in the classroom, you were going to see on this robot. All right. And so all the different topics were actually going to be explored, touched, seen physically. And I think a lot of people appreciated that to help learn things. Here's an idea of one of the practicums. And it gives you an idea, there's no big write-ups or anything like that. The idea is you're going to go make this robot autonomously dive down. And this is actually a plots of them tracking the blue desired depths. The red is the actual depth of the robot that they got. All they do is they have to submit this plot as opposed to writing up a big report about it. And this is really more forced learning than anything. And these robots provided a great way not to just bring the technology side, but the application side. You know, you could see as a biologist, if you want to go out in the lake and you want to sample different temperatures at different depths, these robots might be a great way to do it. And in fact, the culminating experience for this course is crossing the street to Bernard Field Station and taking the robot you built and deploying it in the lake there to collect data. One of the great sort of benefits of this is better learning. We've run pre and post tests for years on this course. You can see that with the previous course of E59, we didn't do quite as well as we are now doing, or this was after the first year of data, with E79. And so this sort of demonstrates that we did a lot better in terms of learning with these pre and post tests. And these are not easy, typically, I would say, for the average person. They've got things like Laplace transforms and stuff like that. So unless you take the course, it's going to be tough to get through these tests. What we didn't understand until we got into it was how much all the context of the theory was going to provide. I mean, we did a lot of different innovations in this course, and the teaching team was fantastic in terms of bringing new innovations, not me alone at all. This was a whole bunch of us. But if you looked at these grades from E59 by gender, there's a potentially, or definitely, I would say, troubling trend here in that the men, or those identifying as men, seem to be outperforming academically over the women. And this, is, of course, is quite troubling for all sorts of reasons. But with the new course, so this was the years previous with E59. With the new course, we started to get some hope. So this is after our first exam performance. You can see that the female in the darker blue here, actually, you know, they're doing on par, if not even all the bars are actually higher than the men in this case. And you saw in that chart in that GPA academic performance, this was the final grade performance. I don't know about you, but I cannot see any difference in terms of final grades between those identifying as female and those identifying as male. So this is a great benefit, and it sort of goes to show you that a lot of effort in teaching can actually lead to some really strong gains in learning. And it can also put to bed a bunch of bad stereotypes of how your identity might affect your ability to learn a particular material, a particular topic of material. So with that, I think I'm close to out of time. Hopefully that sort of showed you a huge breadth in robotics in terms of the technologies. We saw all sorts of probability theory, control theory, different types of robots, different sort of types of hardware. So there's all this breadth in crossing boundaries in this sort of disciplines and technology, but the applications as well. We go into sociology, archaeology, marine biology, oceanography, which I didn't get as much to talk about, but it's quite broad and far-reaching. And so I'll say a big, huge thank you to a whole bunch of people who, you know, this is by no means just me at all. A lot of people went into this. And Vanessa, I'll leave it up to you. I actually had received some questions a priori, which I can try to go through quickly, or should I take some live?
I do have a few live questions before you do the pre-submitted ones. How do you determine how close the robot would need to be to affect the shark's behavior?
Okay, so that's actually a question for Chris Lowe, this guy right here, the shark expert. But it's dependent on the shark species. And so with the leopard sharks that we start with, you know, you can actually get probably with, you know, 5 meters maybe 10 meters. We probably keep that radius of the formation around 10 meters, but with the white sharks, quite a bit more, to be honest. And so we've done some work with white sharks.
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about autonomous mesh robots?
Autonomous mesh robots. I'm not, do you mean a mesh as in a large distribution that are forming a mesh?
There's a follow-up that says, I have heard there are scary military applications.
Of robots? I would argue that, I mean, this is my, maybe not the best response, but all technology has potential to do scary things. I'll say that, whether you think it's military or not. And I have certainly, you know, chosen projects carefully when approached by different groups to work with. And so I don't know which particular example that is referring to, but I've definitely seen and experienced, you know, conversations with people trying to get even my robots to do things like put guns on them and stuff like that, which to me is scary. Maybe not for the people, but for me, there are some very scary things that you can do with some of this stuff. And yes, people I know, and I've met people who are trying to do those things.
Thank you. How did you choose the locations of the clusters, and were those clusters fixed locations when tracking swarms of fish?
We experimented with a bunch of different clustering techniques. I think the ones that we saw there were made from either subtractive clustering, or I think we started with k-means clustering algorithms, and then we went to something called subtractive clustering, where you don't have to know the number of clusters to actually kick it off.
Great. And then my last live question for you. Have you seen the work from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute have done with their UAVs?
I've seen quite a bit of work done from MBARI. I'm not sure what we're referring to, but actually all of my underwater robot stuff was started by inspiration when I was a graduate student. And the person at the desk next to me was working with MBARI, autonomously tracking jellyfish around the ocean. And I thought, if I ever get to be a professor, I'm going to try to do something just like that. Typically, the MBARI people used to show up at the same conference as me for underwater technology, and they do some fantastic work. And I highly recommend anyone interested in this stuff to look for internships there.
Great, thank you. Chris, if you can go through the submitted questions really quickly, that'd be great.
Yeah, okay, so I'll do my best here. Some of them I'm definitely not expert enough in because they're sort of a bit outside the realm here. So one of the questions, do you expect to see more widespread use of robotics in farming agriculture in the future? And I would say yes. I see startups. So there's one here, I just like within 10 seconds of Googling, I found one. But moreover, for the last decade, there's been, if you go to robotics conferences, there's tracks in the conference dedicated to, and workshops dedicated to agricultural farming. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff in the media that you can find in this, but there are definitely companies who have come up with this. And one of the reasons to think about this stuff is because mobile robots do really well when you can control the environment, you can control the infrastructure. In things like farms, it's typically owned by a single organization that can set up, we're going to make rows of these plants, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. So they can actually control like who can go in and out and things like that. So it's actually a great application. Not always easy, depending on what you're trying to do. Like some of the picking applications are difficult, but still, I think it's a great place for robots. Another question was, how much do you let the robots have AI or control remain central? What is your vision? And so I think for scalability, we need to let the robots have more and more of their own. That's just my opinion. I'm not, for whatever reason, not worried about the robots taking over the world right now. There is so much to be gained by letting the robots make their own decisions within the right situation. You know, one example I just pulled up. So this is an image of, I think people have seen cars do autonomous parking before probably, or at least seen ads for them. This is a great use of technology. It's really sort of doing something all on its own. But I think what this question is really getting to, here's a snapshot of a paper that I published many years ago. I think this is probably in 2007 or something. Oh, sorry, actually this one was the the work started in 2007, publication was 2013. But the idea is to let vehicles work out within ad hoc networks where they should drive, which highway lane they should drive on the highway, and to have a decentralized approach to this so that all the vehicles can decide in response to the world where they should go. And this has huge benefits for, and we sort of tried to show and demonstrate for the environment and things like that, things much more efficient in terms of both, not just time, but fuel efficiency and consumption, fuel consumption. So there's a lot of gains you can make by letting independent decision-making go on. And basically when you say decentralized is the only way to really scale these things up, in my opinion. So. Another question, cross-disciplinary is a broad term, but usually is STEM only. Does environmental research uniquely attract these kinds of projects? I would say it shouldn't be STEM only, and I try to sort of highlight archaeology, and there's art, there's all sorts of things that goes within robots that cross boundaries. But yes, I do think that these environmental research uniquely attract these kinds of projects because they have made it, they've allowed a jump of a huge amount of data gain. Like I know biologists, for example, who went from, dropping, if they go to the lake like this is a fjord we went to up in Denmark, they might boat around and drop a sensor in every hour in different spots, and the robot will go out an hour and collect, tens of thousands of measurements in the same amount of time. And now you've got this huge volume of data, which you can do a lot more with than just a few different data samples. So robots do really well for the environmental monitoring type situations. Given that robotics are capable of automating more and more complex tasks, you believe robotics will widen wealth gaps in the US by slashing jobs and driving down cost of production? So first of all, I'll just say I don't know. I haven't actually studied this myself, but I have sort of tried to read up on it a bit. This question was asked me directly when I started my master's way back when in 96 or 7 or something like that. And I was sort of thinking about that as well. Like, do I want to get into this stuff because of it? And at the time, it turned out that it was not slashing jobs. But, there's actually, this report was just released by MIT pretty recently, which is some interesting quotes here. I think it does affect things, and I do worry about the widening of wealth gaps. But I wouldn't just say wealth. I think there's some socioeconomic differences that sort of, I don't know if socioeconomic is the right term to use here, but depending on your identity, I think this affects you differently. When I've seen, for example, even the people who are doing really well with robotics, and this gets to one of the last questions as well, I would say it's not as diverse of a bunch of people involved in the community as it should be. And it's pretty obvious. The community is not that big in the, like robotics experts, it's not that big a community, to be honest. And it's not nearly as diverse as it should be in terms of a background identity. So I'm sort of, in one axis, worried about this right here that you see on the screen, but I'm also worried about who's allowed to even get into robotics. This next question was, I'm a high school robotics teacher. If I have 1 year with students, what is the most important things I should teach with them, and what should they be exposed to? What do I do with that year? And my reaction was, first of all, okay, I don't know exactly what the best thing is. I've never really thought about what is the best. But it sort of gets back to what I was just discussing on the last slide. First robotics has done really well, but anecdotally, it's done well for a select bunch of students. I watch my own kids even going through and getting, what do they get exposed to? And I think your background lets you get exposed to more things. I also am worried about the gender balance in robotics. It's very one-sided in my opinion, which is troubling. And I wonder if maybe one of the things to think about is this, again, this idea of context. And maybe, you can go online and find, hey, here's a kit with a robot, go build this. And I look at that robot and I think, if that's what we're advertising to high school students, for me, that's super exciting. I look at that and it's super cool. I love all the wires and I love the programming and stuff like that. But I'm pretty sure there's a whole bunch of people who are not going to be attracted to it. They're attracted more to the application side or something else. not everyone, everyone's got, you know, we shouldn't stereotype who's going to be interested in what, but I don't think that this types of picture and this types of tools broad enough, in my opinion, to capture and attract people from all different identities. And so I would personally think about, well, what is the context? How can we make robotics more accessible and more exciting to people, to get people from all sorts of backgrounds involved? Because right now, when I look anecdotally in the academia and in industry, it's just not diverse enough. Do you see the progress of robotics in the near future as being driven solely by powerful entities with a lot of capital? Do you give much purchase to the idea of democratized automation and robotic development as a result of the cheapening and spreading of powerful computers and actuators? All right, so this is interesting because I've said over the last 10, 20 years that this bomb, I mean, like I said, you look at that library I started with, there was nothing. There was no parts, there's no robot shop. This is actually a picture from a robot shop where you can just go and shop online and have something within 24 hours, all the parts you want. So yes, there's accessibility, but really, who is this, who actually gets attracted to this? Who is this meant for? I get a little bit worried about that. When I look at, there are a lot of startups now coming up. But the people involved, again, I would say, I'm worried about who's getting access and who's getting into the startups. I would say it's not the most diverse group of people that I've ever seen. And so that's one of the things I'm concerned about. So part of it's to do with wealth. Part of it's to do with where you started from in life as well, I think. And that's not just always wealth. And so is it only going to be big entities? I don't think it is just big entities. I see lots of small startups and I think they are do well. I think in some venues, you need the wealth, but maybe not others. So I see lots of cool startups coming up and I think they might do well some. So.
Great, thank you, Chris. I want to thank Professor Chris Clark for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for attending this event. We will follow up within the next week with the recorded video and presentation materials. Our next Mud Talks is GPS, It's True and Amazing Story with John Labracas, class of 74, on Tuesday, February 11th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. An announcement for current parents. Family February is now here. Please visit hmc.edu/parents for the scheduled events and registration links. A weekly digest will be sent to you every Monday of all events happening that week. As a reminder, Inside Mud for Families is tomorrow, February 4th at 1 p.m. Pacific time. All upcoming events can be found on our online offerings page using the link included in your confirmation email or by visiting alumni.hmc.edu and clicking on online offerings. We welcome any suggestions you may have for upcoming events, or if you are interested in hosting one, please email us at alumni@hmc.edu. Thanks again for joining us and have a great night, everyone. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.